Well, welcome everyone who has joined us so far. I'm Lynn Abramson, President of the Clean Energy Business Network, and I'm pleased to be co-hosting this webinar with our partners at the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, and I'll have their president, Lisa Jacobson, introduce herself in just a moment. And we really appreciate all of our panelists and our audience taking the time to join us this afternoon. A few quick words of housekeeping before we begin. We are activating the video camera for the panelist discussion. I would encourage those of you who are not presenting on this call to turn off your cameras so that it's not as distracting, but we did want to have it possible for the fireside chat with our state officials for you to be able to see their faces and tune into that conversation. We also encourage everyone to please keep yourself on mute throughout this webinar. You can submit questions at any point using the chat function, and we will go over questions at the end. We're expecting about an hour of remarks, and then we've reserved the last 15 minutes for those who want to remain on the line to participate in the audience Q&A discussion. And finally, we are recording this webinar, and we will share that recording with all of you, along with the slide deck and a few important links after this call. So really appreciate everyone who has taken the time to join our conversation. And today we're going to be talking about State of Play, a Clean Energy Powered Recovery. This is a part of a webinar series that has been ongoing between the Business Council for Sustainable Energy and Clean Energy Business Network. This is now the third episode of our Powering Forward series, which examines the unique impacts facing clean energy industries during COVID-19 and the vital role our sectors will play in our future economic recovery. And today's conversation is focusing on some state climate and energy resilience initiatives, how COVID-19 has impacted those efforts, and state priorities for economic recovery. And we're going to conclude with a brief discussion on ways that the federal government might be able to provide assistance to state and local communities. So to kick it off, we're going to start with, I wanted to first thank our partners, the Pew Charitable Trust and the National Governors Association, for their partnership on this episode, along with our sponsors of our ongoing series, which include CREST Forum, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions Forum, which is participating in this series leading up to National Clean Energy Week at the end of September, and the Texas Investment Managers, which is offering the first ESG screened target date for a 1K plan. So this is our agenda for today's discussion. So again, Lisa Jacobson, who is president of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, and I are co-hosting this, and you will be hearing from our colleague, Andy Barnes, our program manager, at the end of this webinar. But we're going to start off in a few moments after some brief words of introduction from myself and Lisa with a panel that's going to examine state resilience and COVID-19 response. And we're really pleased to be joined by Laura Lightbody, who is the project director at the Flood Prepared Communities Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trust, which is focusing on a lot of resilience efforts, particularly relating to climate resilience. And she's going to be moderating discussion with Mike Harryman, who is State Resilience Officer for the Oregon Governor Kate Brown, along with Dr. Rebecca French, who is Director of the Office of Climate Planning for the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. So we're going to be hearing from them a bit about how their states are managing energy and climate resilience and the COVID-19 response. And then we're going to hear from two industry respondents, including Jillian Dash, who is principal and co-founder and founder of Capacity, and Natalie Joubert, who is manager of federal affairs at PG&E. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Lisa for a moment so she can give a brief introduction of the Business Council.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And it's really a pleasure to be partnering with Pew Charitable Trust, the National Governors Association, and to see the strong participation by states in the private sector. That has been a real cornerstone of this series. How do we help create partnerships, alignment, and share best practices between the private sector and state, local, and federal policymakers, and help inform all of those policy conversations. So the Business Council for Sustainable Energy is a broad-based trade association based in Washington, D.C., and we focus primarily on policy, education, and advocacy to help affordably and quickly deploy the broad portfolio of readily available clean energy technologies. And as you already mentioned, this has been an area of strategic importance for the Council prior to the COVID pandemic, and clearly we are learning more each day about how improved resilience will help households, communities, and businesses evolve and adapt in the current environment that we're in. So it's really a pleasure to be a part of this series. And thank you for your leadership, Lynn, at the Clean Energy Business Network for putting this together. Here is just a sampling of some of the Council's members, and I'll let you share a little bit more about CEBN.
Thank you, Lisa. So Clean Energy Business Network is a small business division of the Business Council, and we serve as the small business voice for the clean energy economy, working to enhance opportunities for small and mid-sized clean energy providers. And we do this in three primary areas, and you can see that highlighted on this screen. So the first is policy support, working to inform and engage small businesses in policy issues impacting market opportunities for clean energy. The second area is in market and technology education, and this is both internally facing within the industry, sharing information, as well as externally facing to promote awareness of the benefits of clean energy among stakeholders, customers, and policymakers. And then finally, we work to provide business development assistance, mainly in the form of promoting industry collaboration and aggregating useful information and opportunities for exposure. And you can see we have grown to a little over 4,000 members across all 50 U.S. states representing diverse technologies. And I'll note that we were originally founded by the Pew Charitable Trust in 2009 and spun out 3 years ago to launch as a new organization in our own right. So it's really exciting to get to collaborate with Pew and with Laura's team on today's webinar. And just as a final note, these are just a few examples of the way that the Business Council and the Clean Energy Business Network have been engaging in conversations around the topic of resilience for quite some time now. So Lisa, I don't know if you want to maybe just give a quick overview of the BCSE Resilience and Reliability Dialogue.
Yes, we launched that about 3 years ago at the board level. And it has involved bringing in thought leaders and influencers on this topic. And we've been very pleased to have NGA and Pew Charitable Trust as part of our thought leaders series. I think we've had, over 30 individuals and groups represented to share information about how the energy sector is part of the resilience solution set and how we can all work together to make improvements. We also have been doing educational convenings, and the Powering Forward webinar series is an excellent example of that. We've also, through our federal programs led by Ruth McCormick on the BCSE staff, done many interactions with congressional staff on the key committees that are responsible for appropriations and new programs to help foster resilience investments. So there's a lot of congressional outreach we're doing here in Washington, but I would note that, as part of our Resilience and Reliability Dialogue and Thought Leaders series, we also have been releasing blogs and other publications, and we released a new blog today on this topic. So I encourage everybody to read that and to be part of that ongoing conversation. We would welcome your reactions, both in the Q&A today, but also, longer term. So thank you very much, Lynn.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. And with that, we are here today to talk about a clean energy-powered recovery. And as I noted earlier, look at some of the efforts being undertaken by leaders in states. And so I'm going to be turning it over now to Laura Lightbody, who is Project Director for Pew's Flood Prepared Communities Initiative. We're going to have her and each of our two state panelists give some brief introductory remarks, and then I'm going to actually turn off the screen sharing at that point and open up the video. And just for housekeeping, when we do that, because we'd like to try to facilitate conversation, I'd encourage those who are not presenting to turn off your video so we can focus on our panelists, and you can click on those little buttons at the top right corner of your video view to change how you are viewing their video. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Laura. Now you're good to go. I think you are remuting yourself somehow. Let's turn.
Okay.
Now I hear you.
I'm gonna, sorry, we tested this. I'm gonna drop my phone. Okay. You can hear me? Everything's good?
Yep, you sound great.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that. Drop my earbuds, don't need them. Okay. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Lisa. Pew's really excited to be joining with the National Governors Association to partner on this topic, which is really a sweet spot for us. So we're excited to talk about it and excited to join both organizations in having this discussion. Before we jump into the meat of the discussion, which is really designed to be sort of a Q&A with both Mike Harryman and Rebecca French, I just wanted to briefly just tell you who we are at Pew. If you don't mind going to the next slide. So our program, we're based in Washington, D.C. There we go. Thanks. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we're focused on both policy and regulatory solutions at both the federal and the state levels to reduce the impact of flood-related disasters on the U.S. economy and on the environment. So we focus really for simplification purposes. I have these 4 boxes and simple words up here, but many of you on the call will know that it's not as simple as that. But we really try to take a comprehensive look at reducing the impact of natural hazards to communities. I will not spend a lot of time talking about our infrastructure initiative, as that is really the second part of this discussion. But we are also sort of heavily engaged right now with Congress and the administration on infrastructure initiatives and how we can really use the federal government to drive more resiliency with states and communities. I just want to mention we do focus primarily on flooding because it is our nation's number one most costly and common natural disaster that impacts all 50 states. Both flood and coastal storm events have caused the nation over $845 billion in overall losses since 2000. And unfortunately, those numbers are expected to increase with projections about more frequent downpours, intensifying hurricane, and rising sea levels. As you all know, these impacts overwhelm all levels of government. That growing financial risk and exposure puts pressure on states and communities to get in the game in terms of not only budgeting for disasters and recovery, but also planning and preparing to ultimately reduce the impact and the costs to communities, to infrastructure, to systems. This places a lot of strain on localities to meet federal matches. They're stretched thin in terms of expertise and bandwidth. States have competing priorities, siloed programs. Likewise, usually strained budgets, and now particularly strained budgets. Next slide. As a result, though, we are seeing some positive come of this, which is an increasing trend by states to adapt and respond to these stressors and pressures by investing in preparedness, planning, disaster mitigation, resiliency efforts, which we're going to hear a little bit more about in our discussion. This graphic I like to put up because this is an investment that we know pays off. The national average for return on what's called pre-disaster mitigation risk reduction activities is on average about $1 invested saves roughly $6 in overall recovery costs. But as you can see, those numbers vary by state, oftentimes more than $6, and they also vary by peril. And so in the instance of flooding, actually those numbers are much higher. You're looking closer to $10, $11 on a return. So it's an investment that makes sense. Next slide. Which is why at Pew we've spent a lot of time working with states to put in place comprehensive plans that address natural hazards in a comprehensive, statewide, and also durable manner. Most recent example of that, North Carolina just released its climate risk and resilience plan back in June that guides state action, including energy assets and their risk. Last fall, we published research that I'll just point you to called Mitigation Matters. The link is down at the bottom of this slide, that analyzed 13 state and local policies and regulations that are aimed at really driving mitigation. And what we found in this is really that these policy changes have served as a direct catalyst for mitigation activities and projects, and they continue to limit the impact of flooding in communities. So much more to read about that if you're interested, pewtrust.org/mitigation matters. So before we get into discussion, I believe both Rebecca and Mike are going to just provide some brief introductory remarks. And so I will turn it over to Dr. Rebecca French.
Hi, thank you, Laura. I appreciate the opportunity to join you all today and talk a little bit about the situation in the state of Connecticut. I'm actually fairly new to this position as the director of the Office of Climate Planning, but I've been working on risk and resiliency, recovery and resiliency efforts, I should say, in Connecticut since 2014 in a variety of roles. So I'm going to just quickly touch on a few programs. This is by no means an exhaustive list of what's going on, but I thought I wanted to highlight that we have a microgrid program in Connecticut that's been going on for a few years now. You can see that we've installed or approved or have multiple projects under review across Connecticut, and this was in response to significant and frequent power outages that we do experience in Connecticut when we have large storms or smaller, more regular storms like our nor'easters that hit us on a regular basis in Connecticut. That's our name for big snowstorms. And so these microgrids help to power emergency emergency response and shelter areas across the state. Next slide, please. Another program that's Connecticut's really proud to be a part of, the National Disaster Resilience Program. This Connecticut was one of 13 winners of the National Disaster Resilience Competition that was put out by HUD in 2015, and those funds were awarded to the state in 2016, and were well underway in implementing the project. And the reason I wanted to highlight it to this group that's focused on energy is this is actually a flood control project. We are a state where flooding, yes, is indeed one of the natural disaster that most impacts us. And this neighborhood is highly vulnerable to both coastal and inland flooding. This is the south end of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and it's also the location of 2 substations, a natural gas-fired power plant, and 2 natural gas-fired power plants. So it's a significant energy critical infrastructure area as well. So this flood protection project, although was actually focused on protecting sort of low-income communities and housing, which is also an important part of this neighborhood, also serves to protect a critical power infrastructure, and it serves as an example of community resiliency, working together with strengthening the resiliency of our electric grid and power generation systems. Next slide, please. Those were projects that were ongoing pre-COVID. We actually started this planning process, and COVID hit Connecticut in the middle of it. We launched the Governor's Council on Climate Change under Governor Lamont through executive order in September 2019, and the council met for the first time in December. And we formed 7 work group areas of progress on mitigation strategies, working in natural lands, science and technology, equity and environmental justice, infrastructure and land use adaptation, public health and safety, and financing adaptation and resilience. And those work groups were in the middle of their deliberations to provide recommended strategies to the council. But we have been able to continue that process online. We've actually conducted 120 plus collaborative meetings since we started meeting in January. And the goals of this group are to meet the goals in the executive order, which is a 0 carbon target for electricity sector by 2040, and continuing progress towards implementing a 45% reduction in CO2 levels by 2030, as well as generating the state's first statewide adaptation and resilience plan. And this has been a highly inclusive process, 100 contributing organizations and 162 individual work group members. So in terms of how COVID has impacted us, it didn't go down, this was not quite how we expected to do this process. It was moved entirely online, but it has continued despite the impacts of the pandemic, thanks to the resilience of the great people of Connecticut. Next slide, please. And then I finally want to close on another program that might be of interest to this group. Our Public Utility Regulatory Authority released a docket on resilience and reliability just a few days ago on July 22nd. And they're going to be starting a process of fact-finding and solutions on distribution system planning of the electric distribution companies for resilience and reliability standards and program. And they've outlined 3 paths here. And I'm just inviting anyone who's interested in this to be part of that process. So this is an open docket, and the technical meetings are going to take place in September and October. So again, we're still in response and recovery to COVID, but we're continuing our planning work on resilience and reliability. And that's it for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. And Mike?
Yeah, thank you very, very much. Thank you for the opportunity. I'd like to thank, the Clean Energy Business Network, the Business Council Sustainable Energy, the National Governors Association, and the Pew Charitable Trust for allowing the state of Oregon to provide some insight into what we're working on here around resiliency. You can go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit about how this position became created. Our natural hazard, our largest natural hazard in the state of Oregon we face is called the Cascadia Subduction Zone. And it's runs pretty much from the southern tip of the Vancouver Island to Northern California off the Oregon coastline. And over the last 10,000 years, it's ruptured 41 times. 9 of those times have been 9.0 or greater. And the last time it ruptured was in January 1700, so it's 320 years old since the last rupture. And scientists tell us percentages, depending on what part of the state you live in, the impacts. And so legislators decided to task our seismic commission to come up with what they called a plan. This commission took about 18 months with 170 volunteers and came up with a 50-year plan on how the state can become more resilient. And it's known as the Oregon Resiliency Plan, and it was introduced to our legislators in 2013. Imagine a 50-year plan provided to legislators who look at budgets on a 2-year cycle. It was pretty overwhelming with all the recommendations. So they created a task force, and the task force came back and said, we need to have somebody in a position to actually lead this effort for both resiliency and policy issues. And it was decided to create the State Resilience Office for position, and it was put in statute. And the position is required to be confirmed by the state Senate, and I was confirmed in May of 2016. Also in 2016, we had just completed a huge exercise on the earthquake, and we decided we need to become a 2-week ready state instead of a 3-day or 72-hour kit that we've heard through multiple sources, and a good colleague is the American Red Cross. And so our American Red Cross in the Northwest sector, we worked with them to also push 2 weeks ready, and they did very heartily. Governor Brown released her Resiliency 2025 vision, and we went into and it focused on a 2-week ready campaign, staging bases and things like that, that really kind of pushed the envelope as far as with our legislators to get funding and also to provide stuff for the public to understand what it really means to be 2-week ready for a major shutdown of our critical infrastructure. Simultaneously, Governor Brown introduced a climate bill to do cap and trade in 2019, and it made national news. Our Republicans on the Senate side walked out, so that bill died. And so did the governor's resiliency funding for her resiliency plan, which had 6 strategies. We brought them back in 2020 to our short session in February prior to COVID-19 impact in the state. And again, this time, both the House and the Senate Republicans walked out. So there was only 2 or 3 bills passed in the entire session. And once again, the governor's resiliency and climate bill died in session. So being the resilience officer, working with the energy and climate policy advisor, Dr. Kristen Sharon in the state, we just bounce right back. We're going back after it. We're working on resiliency all the time. We talk to our legislators, our policymakers, and the public whenever possible. And then in 2019, we had the big IOUs come in and give Governor Brown a briefing on the public safety power shutoffs that we were learning about, and it was an eye-opener. One of the things, we had 2 of the big companies in with BPA, and they talked about their major issues that they face on a daily basis: cybersecurity, wildland fires, and earthquakes. Those are the big things that keep these presidents and CEOs up at night worrying about. Next slide, please. So these are COVID-19 comes along, and our work on seismic stuff over the last 4 years proved valuable for how we responded as a state for COVID-19. At the state level, the governor has a disaster cabinet established under one of her executive orders when she became governor early on in her tenure, and I've exercised that group on 2 tabletops, and one of the tabletops was on pandemic flu. And we brought in the major agencies. There's 33 of them under our statutory authority that provide some type of response to the governor under a declaration. We enacted that. We established an incident management teams at our state office of emergency management, and one of the branches we created was our critical infrastructure branch. And it met on a daily basis with our incident management teams, staff from the Office of the Oregon Public Utilities Commission, the PUC in Oregon, and the Oregon Department of Energy provided key staff and leadership to that, and all our IOUs and most of our COUs participated in that mainly to get updates of information and to provide us information, about the safety of their workforce. They enacted their business continuity plans around pandemics. We worked with the BPA just to make sure we could understand what they were seeing. And our small utilities affirmed their mutual aid support was in place across the state. Oregon, we did not identify any essential workers. And that's kind of critical because what we did do, governor shut down restaurants in the middle of March, and gyms and salons and bars and everything. We just closed those for the safety. We let the businesses determine if they weren't part of that group to continue working, such as construction and manufacturers in Oregon. We got some pushback. Some of our federal partners asked us why we had not used the Homeland Security Essential Workforce. We just decided that we did not want to go down that path and have to ID people. And we did have some hiccups in that, and we worked with those particular contractors through our critical infrastructure branch that we had. Since then, we have done weekly calls that are staffed by our PUC staff. A lot of the PUCs or the IOUs and COUs, they just continue to want to make sure they were getting good guidance. I will tell you, protective equipment, PPE, was definitely the hot topic almost the entire time, and even to this day. And we felt the shortage like everyone else across the United States. We focused on what PPE came in was first provided to our healthcare industries, our first responders, and our prison system. And then we made sure we also worked with our critical infrastructure and our IOUs and COUs when we did start receiving PPE from FEMA and our system. We provided it to their workforce as much as possible. And I would say they worked hand in hand with us to make sure we distributed that through their systems and how we got it to them. We also did the same thing on the water and wastewater side. So it wasn't just around our energy providers. We did have some outbreaks, and some of our larger ones under their business continuity seemed to handle the outbreaks within their workforce. But we were very worried about our small utilities, our COUs, that have some of them have less than 10 full-time staff, and so we were very making sure. One, we paid attention to them. Two, that they made sure they had as much PPE as we could possibly get to them, and they stayed home when they weren't at work to avoid from getting COVID-19. And we crossed our fingers and have been very lucky that we came close a couple times, from what I understand, to a couple of them having some personnel issues. But with that firm mutual aid support in place across these utilities, we feel like we did have some backup. And I would just like to these possible support for both private sector and legislative. We've seen, low income families hit very hard by COVID-19 and energy assistance programs. We were very pleased that our IOUs did not shut off power to any homeowner or any renter across the board. That's been extremely grateful that they have not done that. But at the same time, we need to find out how to, get reimbursement to them. We're looking forward to the new FEMA grant, Building Resilience Infrastructure and Communities, the BRIC grant. Is a great opportunity to impact our pre-mitigation efforts in the state of Oregon. And then just possible identification of essential workers that we've seen from other states, how they do from state to state if we enact the EMAC system, the Emergency Management Assistant Compact. Continue building on mutual aid. It's you just can never not talk about this enough. The more you can provide support in the state, from the valley to the to the eastern side of the state, is very important, or vice versa. And then just clarify the roles of the energy sector as critical protections, for the mobility of the supply and testing of the energy. Testing is the biggest thing in our state. We just continue to need more testing all the time. And since we're not considered one of the hot states under the terms that CDC uses, sometimes resources don't necessarily come into our state like they are in the other ones that are having much higher COVID-19 and death rates. And then just more funding for energy assistance for low income in our vulnerable communities would be awesome to see at the federal level. And we really appreciate that. And with that, that's my last slide. And then I'll turn it back over to Laura.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to work to make sure we get all of our panelists unmuted again. And then I'm going to go ahead and to enable a little bit more of a conversational dynamic for the panel, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And again, I encourage those of you who are not speaking to please, keep yourself on mute and keep your video camera off so that we can focus on our panelists. So with that, we'll turn it back over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Lynn. I think we will just jump right into it. We're going to start more negative and increasingly get more positive. And only because I feel like we have to start with the obvious, which is that Mike touched on quite a bit, and I'm interested to hear Rebecca elaborate a little bit. But given the pressure that states are feeling on revenue collection right now, there is no doubt going to be major budget shortfalls this session, if it already hasn't happened in your state. And the full implication of those gaps are really yet to be fully realized, and may be felt for many years to come. And I know that the energy and environment space, resiliency space, is one that has received a lot, has been sort of on the receiving end of a lot of those cuts. So, if there's any piece of that you want to speak to specifically regarding to budgets, but more on the positive side, I'm really interested to hear how you have been able to sort of pivot and adapt and continue moving efforts forward despite everything that you're faced with right now, on energy resilience. So Rebecca, I'll start with you, and Mike, you touched on it a lot, but if there's anything else you want to bring up, that'd be great.
Great, thank you, Laura. So on the budget question, obviously Connecticut was hit hard by the pandemic, and we saw disproportionate impacts on our urban centers and our communities of color, and that's significant for thinking about climate resilience as well, because so the same communities that we saw hit hard by Superstorm Sandy, which was sort of one of our biggest recent disasters back in 2012, that some of those same communities that have been hit hard by COVID were also particularly hit hard by Sandy, and we're also, we saw from Sandy, we're slower to recover, still in recovery mode. In fact, that's what that project I highlighted about, the National Disaster Resilience Project, is focused on Bridgeport, Connecticut, and that's one of the communities that is still in recovery from Hurricane Sandy and is highly impacted by COVID. So I think that's important to see that there's a nexus there, and if you see that nexus there, it also means that some of the underlying conditions in our communities are what making us more resilient to those can also make us more resilient to both to hurricanes and to pandemics. So that that's a lesson that we're learning and seeing unfold in our state, and it's definitely impacted what we are carrying forward, which are these planning processes. So as I said, the Governor's Council on Climate Change started just a few weeks prior to Connecticut going into a stay safe, stay home order, but continued online. And we've seen, as our members of our work groups, feeling the direct effects of the pandemic, dealing with working from home, dealing with direct getting sick, and seeing how that's playing out in our communities, they're bringing that into their thinking about climate resilience. And so we're seeing that kind of nexus play out in our planning process, and it's particularly elevated issues of equity and environmental justice in our thinking about both from the carbon mitigation side, making sure that our environmental justice communities are equitably sharing in the costs and benefits of strategies we take to reduce emissions, and that we particularly prioritize communities that are disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change when we look at adaptation strategies to climate change impacts we're already feeling and will continue to feel in our state. So I think I'll stop there maybe and go over. Yeah.
Great. I don't know, Mike, is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, I do. I think Oregon is much like Connecticut. We did miss the boat badly of when we did our first initial response, because we were just focused at a certain age, 65 and above. We missed our vulnerable populations. And when we started receiving data from our epidemiologists at the state, we realized our Asian and Pacific Islander folks were hit pretty hard, and our Latino community was hit very hard, and our Black community was hit extremely hard. So we have done a 180 on that, and our Governor Brown is very focused on racial justice. And so she's asking me to work with the other members of the policy group to come up with a resilient package that focuses on racial justice for our 21-23. And in 2008 and 2009, after the economic downturn, Oregon established a rainy day fund. So we have a little bit over $1 billion sitting in our pockets that we are going to use, the governor's going to use to help fill the hole of some of our budget cuts that we're seeing, mainly from just our revenue income has been drastically hit. And I'd just like to say that on a positive note, staying focused on this, one of the big things that I should have mentioned in my presentation is Oregon is on the West Coast. We are on with California and Washington working on an earthquake early warning system known as Shake Alert. And the Shake Alert system, we have failed 2 times to get funding, but we're trying again. We're probably going to have a special session in the next couple weeks. And once again, the governor is going to ask our legislators to fund with bonding, general obligated bonds to build out our Shake Alert system by 2023 so that we can provide services. And we're working with one of our big IOUs as a pilot project on that. And that could give citizens 30 seconds or longer, depending on where the subduction zone unzips. And so, it's just one of those things where you got to worry about the folks that cannot necessarily be 2-week ready, our low-income families, folks who don't trust the government. And we really want to make sure that we're providing them as much information as we can, and to their community-based organizations to provide that support as well. So I'll stop right there.
Great. But both of you touched on a little bit some of the limitations that you've faced or hurdles that you face either due to politics or funding issues that you've faced at the state level. And so when you think about what's needed or what more could be done, maybe through the lens of the private sector, because that's who our audience is here, but also the federal government, what do you need? What new programs, new incentives, partnerships are needed to really enhance the resiliency of the energy sector in your states? Rebecca, we'll start with you.
Hi. So I did want to highlight that in terms of looking at the COVID recovery and the budget, that although we're kind of still realizing what exactly that will mean for the state of Connecticut, at our state level, I will highlight that Connecticut is part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, and they just last week or late the week before sent a letter to Congress in support of COVID stimulus, COVID recovery stimulus, to help states and municipalities, but also to look at that COVID recovery as an opportunity to invest in energy efficiency and clean energy and resilient infrastructure. So I did want to highlight that, although kind of at the state level, we what might our how this impact our direct budget, we are recognizing that clean energy and infrastructure resilience represents an opportunity to bounce forward and recover from COVID. So I did want to highlight that. But in addition to to that letter, which again we're signed on to as part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, infrastructure investment is incredibly important. That. And thinking about how we could integrate resilience in particular into our federal infrastructure program. So, in recent years, and Laura knows this, better than I do, FEMA is pivoting more, and HUD, these are the 2 federal agencies that are, put out a lot of disaster recovery dollars of don't just build it back the way it was, and build back with resilience. But I would argue that we need to also move in the direction of build it resilient in the first place too. And how do we lower barriers to doing that with federal funds? Allowing for phased approaches in capacity building is incredibly important with federal programs. Sometimes they want us to come out of the gate fully knowing everything that's going on and have a project all set to go, but many communities are not in a position to be able to do that, and they need support to be able to get to that place. I do think the FEMA BRIC program that Oregon's already highlighted is moving in that direction. I see that as a very positive step for the federal government. Benefit cost analyses. I don't know. Yeah, I kind of have a long list, but so I don't want to keep going too much. But there's sort of a list. But I did want to highlight particularly for energy resilience that I highlighted that project that we're doing in Bridgeport. And the reason I highlighted that is because it protects transmission infrastructure, which is important for our clean energy and our grid overall. But it also, you can make an investment that is just inside the fence with your, to making your investment resilient, or you can look at how that investment might actually be brought in outside of the fence and contribute to a community resilience effort. And again, I do think the BRIC program is trying to incentivize that, and we've seen some success with that in Connecticut. And I think that is really what's needed, because in a time of budget crunch, we need to be able to use our funds as efficiently as possible and look for projects that have multiple co-benefits.
Great. Mike?
I'm going to echo what she just mentioned. Pre-mitigation is the game changer. I think the private sector, historically for mitigation dollars, that 25% that the federal government, FEMA, that usually came out of a city, county, or a state budget. And I see the private sector helping us fill that 25% where the states may not be, or the counties may not be able to provide that. And these mitigation efforts could be solely on energy resiliency. They could be part of the distribution generation system, marine energy, and energy storage across the state. We're the 9th largest state in the U.S., and we're a very rural state when you get out of the metropolitan area. And our communities, we have 320 miles of coastline. 11 hospitals are along our coast. We've done resiliency studies on them. And energy and water are the two main things we really need to beef up. And I see pre-mitigation being the game changer that I think the private sector should jump in there with both feet and not be scared to work with city and county officials to actually put those mitigation grants requests in. And if not selected the first time, don't give up. Just keep going at it. That's the resiliency that I would recommend. So thanks.
Thank you both. I think that's a good segue, and we don't have any more time, though I have many more questions to ask both of you, because I think we're going to move into talking about that federal infrastructure initiative happening. And Rebecca, some of your remarks for a good sort of segue into what the needs and gaps are. So appreciate the conversation, particularly with an emphasis on, planning and preparedness. In light of increasing risk. So thank you both, and I will turn it back over to Lynn.
Excellent. Thank you all so much, and definitely have a lot of questions in response to that. But I'm curious now to hear from our industry panelists about their reactions to some of these state-level conversations. And we're going to start off by hearing from Julian Dash, who is principal and founder of Capacity.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I want to thank everyone involved, Lynn in particular, but also the organizations that put it together: Clean Energy Business Network, Business Council for Sustainable Energy, Pew Charitable Trust, and the National Governors Association. So I'll try to be brief. I'm looking at the time. I know we want to keep it kind of 5 minutes for the next two presenters so that we can get into what I believe would hopefully be some good Q&A. So I'll try to run through my slides efficiently. So next slide. Just a little bit about Capacity. We are professional consultants. We provide technical expertise primarily on the procurement and then the management and implementation of distributed renewable energy projects for our clients. Our clients primarily consist of public agencies, both both on the state and the local level, as well as public housing and private affordable housing. And speaking with Lynn, she thought some of our experience and also my direct expertise, having serving in executive functions on 3 different levels of government, would be insightful. So I represent many municipalities, both city, town, urban, suburban, but have also served on executive functions, primarily on school boards in the city of Providence, where, long story short, the school board and school committee, as well as the city, is now moving towards 100% renewables with a remote net meter project. On the state level, I served as State of Rhode Island's Director of the Renewable Energy Office, and continue to serve as a consultant for many state and quasi-public entities, and on a federal level have a long history working, particularly administrative DOE stimulus funding back in 2009, 2010 stimulus era, and represent many public housing authorities and working with Department of Housing and Urban Development. So next slide. So I thought this was a very interesting exercise for myself, because initially when I thought about this, I thought about it from my side, the consulting side, and working with so many different public agencies, kind of what I saw and what my partners saw. But it really gave me an opportunity to kind of go back to all of our clients and our partners and have really robust conversations, and conversations that are normally, when we're engaged with a client, it's a very focused effort that we're looking at. We're looking at procuring solar, or we're looking at procuring a remote net meter project or the like. So this gave us an opportunity to kind of reach back out to clients and partners and have a broader conversation that we don't have on a daily basis. And as you can see, we spoke to a lot of different partners, from state energy offices, green banks, infrastructure banks, incentive programs. I've spoken to some of our legislative leaders, municipal leaders, school districts, water, transit, as well as other consultants in the space. And what I wanted to do was kind of capture what I saw as consensus around those conversations. And I kind of really saw 4 points, which I'll go into a little more detail, which is basically staying the course with respect to primarily policy and programs, but in a good way, preparing buildings for full occupancy, transit, and access to capital. Next slide. So staying the course, and I put this in parentheses in a good way, because I don't want to imply that that nothing's being done in response to COVID. But what I found is a lot of work has already been, the groundwork has already been laid. So there's new programs, there's new incentives, whether it's here in Rhode Island, whether it's in Massachusetts, in New York, and Connecticut, and a lot of the programs that are still relatively new. I found that our public agencies don't want to stay away from them. They want, because a lot of work is going into them. We've heard from both of our prior speakers that Oregon and Connecticut, it takes a lot of stakeholder work. It takes a lot of time. So they want to make sure that even in light of COVID, that these programs are implemented well, and build from there, and not particularly rush into trying to start a new legislative session in introducing new incentives or policies. That's not to say that in staying the course that a lot of our agencies aren't, in response to COVID, kind of accelerating or making some enhancements. I know we've done that in Rhode Island. If you look at Massachusetts, they've doubled the SMART program, as well as some other innovations. You look at New York, they've made some enhancements, particularly their recent announcement of access to capital for low income. So staying the course, I think, is good, and it gives them time to figure out particularly what smart collective policy will be in light of COVID versus just immediately coming up. Preparing buildings for full occupancy and operation has been a common thread. Social distancing is going to be an issue, as well as a lot of buildings from the folks that I spoke to don't believe that they have the adequate HVAC, air circulation, and other measures. So they're going to need, probably in the short term, to make some pretty significant capital improvements in building systems to respond not just to COVID, but in going forward to any events similar to it going forward. Transit, I thought, was a very interesting topic that came up repeatedly, and I say it was interesting because I saw it on 2 fronts. One, some of our partners, be it public transit authorities, and something I didn't think about until I had these conversations, school districts with respect to school buses are really pressed with respect to transit, and they believe that they're going to really need to increase their fleets in order to continue providing the service that they do, whether it's public transportation or school busing, social distancing, and other measures are really putting a strain on how they operate on a day-to-day basis. But also in our other agencies where transit isn't necessarily the core of what they do, but it is impactful either in terms of their work, but also their employees and constituents. We've heard that transit is of interest amongst their constituents and how to deal with transit and more so, the electrification and EV infrastructure that could be built out. And like has already been spoken, so I won't be too redundant, finance and budgeting, whatever level of government you're on, local, state, federal, finance and budgeting is going to be very impactful for obvious reasons, but also long-term, particularly as agencies look to invest in capital and other initiatives. How are they going to finance those measures and then continue to have the operating budget to pay for whatever associated debt service or the like is associated with them? So finance and budgeting, again, as our two prior speakers discussed, is going to be critical. Next slide. So with respect to resiliency, as far as the conversations that I've had, if you see me look, I'm looking at the time, I'm trying to be brief. Solar and storage, particularly as it comes to building improvements that are going to have to be made, as talked about. Solar and storage seems to be the clear interest across all of the sectors that I spoke to. Transit, because of the need for increased transit, be it fleets or the need to increase transit options for other constituents, I think there's a great opportunity for transit-related resiliency, particularly with EVs. And I think as with EVs, it's not just the vehicles themselves, but really the infrastructure that needs to go along with it. Low income and affordable housing seems to be a very common thread, and I think there are a lot of opportunities to really marry resiliency with low income. And when I look at that, it's not necessarily how do we put solar on affordable housing and provide some savings, but where there are other ancillary opportunities to provide transit opportunities, education opportunities, and other opportunities that help broad-based support those who are in low-income and affordable housing communities so that they can be more sustainable in their own lives and not just reduce their energy bills by a little bit. And then environmental justice. I think that's a super broad category. It's one that everyone has kind of alluded to in some respect. And I think there's broader opportunities with respect to environmental justice. I won't try to get into all of them, but I think, besides just having access for certain populations to renewable energy and the savings, but where there are other opportunities, be it education, business development, entrepreneurship, how do we get more minority and women businesses involved in the clean energy economy, particularly if we're going to invest a lot of stimulus or infrastructure dollars into it, how do we make sure that we're all inclusive? And I think this will require a ground-up approach. The one thing I did notice that was quite clear is in all the conversations, I think only once or twice it was proactively brought up by the clients and partners that I spoke to. That's not to say that when I brought it up in conversation, everyone was on board and that they are all for it, and it is a critical component. But as far as it being proactively brought up, it only happened in one or two conversations. So I think it's going to take a ground-up approach and kind of a constant beating of the drum and reminder when we're developing policy incentives and the like with respect to clean energy resiliency and what happens next after COVID. Next slide. So what can the federal government do to support? I think the biggest thing and the most clear and common that I heard is financing and access to capital. I think, if they look at doing a national green bank or if they do a loan guarantee program, what I've heard most is that funds should be made available to states directly so that they can administer programs where they best see fit, reducing and alleviating some of the administrative and bureaucratic restrictions that can often come with these programs. And they need to be made available to both public and private entities and projects. And I found this to be particularly important, particularly if you look at a lot of, say, a lot of our clients do remote net metering projects, which are third-party financed, owned, and operated. If it is third-party owned and it's a private developer undertaking it, if it is going to benefit a public agency, any funding that's available should be made available to those projects, even though it's a private entity that's developing projects to benefit public agencies. As far as incentive programs, and we've already seen this a lot, make them simpler, more direct, and they have to include incentives to support innovation in new markets of business. This is particularly important when it comes to with respect to storage. With respect to policy and what the federal government can do, I think just looking at where policy is from the conversations I had, it would make sense for the federal government to kind of get ahead of states, meaning whatever policy is going to be implemented, let's get it done on a federal level sooner than later so that states can introduce complementary incentives as they see fit versus states kind of introducing policy and then federal government may introduce something that it might not blend as well as we'd like them to. Policy should be all inclusive to cover kind of all aspects of technologies, all aspects of deal structures, again, to allow states to cater to unique needs. And then in the event that we really look at things that we want to focus, be it American manufacturing, environmental justice, or any other measures, there should be smart adders or bonuses put into incentive programs so that you can actually have teeth behind how do you actually get whatever the defined adders are that you want actually implemented in real life projects in deals. So with that, again, I apologize. I think I went 2 minutes over, but I will turn it over to my colleague for her slides.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julian, and appreciate all the many layers of resilience that you discussed. And last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Natalie Joubert, who is manager at PG&E Federal Affairs.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and thank you for inviting me to participate in today's webinar. If you want to go to the next slide, I'll just give a quick background on PG&E. We're an electric and gas utility serving over 16 million people across about a 70,000 square mile service area in northern and central California. And for us, meeting the challenge of climate change has been central to our mission and vision for many years. We strongly support and help advance California's climate and clean energy goals to move towards a low carbon economy. But at the same time, we're committed to supporting climate resilience efforts, both internally at our company, but also within the state and within local communities, so that we can better prepare for, withstand, and recover from extreme weather events. If you go to the next slide, just kind of laying out a little bit more of the challenge that we have as an infrastructure company. We understand that even under kind of a modest carbon reduction scenario, we expect increasing temperatures to continue to affect the frequency and severity of storms, wildfires, and droughts. And a big part of the challenge in planning for this is that, unfortunately, the history is no longer a guidebook because of the pace at which climate change is increasing. If you go to the next slide, just real quick, kind of our approach to addressing this. We have at PG&E an entire climate resilience team who works across our lines of business to incorporate climate change adaptation planning into our risk management process, essentially, better preparing operationally for some of the threats some of which you can see on the slide here, some of the threats that we anticipate before they become a reality. At the community level, we're also working to collaborate on shared resilience opportunities and help build their capacity for resilience planning and implementation. One such program there, and a quick plug for folks who might be interested on the phone. We have a grant program called the Better Together Resilience Communities Program, which is focused on building local climate resilience capacity. We're actually accepting proposals currently for $400,000 grants focused this year on reducing flood risks and supporting healthy and resilient coastlines and wetlands. So if you want to go into the next slide, I'll kind of get to the heart of the matter here. A big role of mine at PG&E and the focus of our discussion today is how can federal policy complement all of the activity that we're doing at PG&E and back in California? And is there a potential with, COVID recovery package at the federal level? Is there an opportunity to help advance some of these priorities? So when I look at kind of, where the opportunities lie, there's kind of three big buckets for me, and I'll quickly go through the first two. First is really, convening experts and utilizing that expertise to share best practices and collaborate on solutions. At PG&E, we're really fond of the Department of Energy's Partnership for Energy Sector Climate Resilience, which is bringing together various public and private entities to focus on resilience, and the current focus has been around utilities and how can we all share best practices and utilize the expertise of the Department of Energy to develop tools to help us better evaluate resilience investments. The second bucket I think about is just the sheer knowledge and capacity of the federal government when it comes to R&D and climate science. We at PG&E leverage data from various federal agencies, including NOAA and NASA and FEMA, to help better understand our exposure to climate risk and to identify the improvements needed. A lot of those programs, unfortunately, have been at risk for cuts in recent years, but we're happy to say that those programs have been funded well, and we hope to continue to support their funding in future appropriations. Finally, I think the biggest bucket of opportunity, and something everyone in this call has talked about now, is really how can the federal government use its power of the purse to either directly invest in resilience or incentivize state, local, tribal governments, private sector, et cetera, to incentivize their own investments, and what are some of the policy barriers that the federal government can help break down to do that. I think with COVID, we're clearly recognizing how underprepared we were to manage a crisis at this scale. And as I think Laura, noted, when you're underprepared and you don't invest, on the front end, you oftentimes end up paying more. And we've seen with pre-disaster mitigation, for every dollar the federal government invests in, as Laura noted, we're saving about $6 in potential cost. I think that return on investment is something that both Republicans and Democrats are starting to recognize. And I think there's a growing awareness that with the enormous economic toll that COVID has had on all of us, that once we get to the point of an economic stimulus package, Congress might seek opportunities to effectively, build back better, make sure that not only existing infrastructure is more resilient to the challenges, but also that if we're building new infrastructure, that it's already prepared to face some of the increasing threats that we're seeing from climate change. I think as part of this, we've already seen some ideas. Earlier this summer, the House passed H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act, that includes a lot of resilience provisions. Of interest to my company, we were closely following and supporting things like grants for grid modernization and microgrids, as well as some of the policy changes to existing programs. A good example would be some of the highway funds. There's now provisions to better prioritize resilience planning. We've also seen this summer the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis has come out with its report, which included multiple chapters on resilience and adaptation, including a lot of ideas and existing legislation around wildfire resilience. Some of those recommendations have already made their way into other House bills, including H.R. 2 and appropriations packages that are moving currently, and we're hopeful that additional recommendations could advance in other manners soon. To the point about soon and what the timing is looking like, I think we've seen this week, given what Senate Republicans have put out and where the House is going, that Congress really needs to focus right now on continuing immediate response to the health and economic crisis. And due to that need, we're probably not going to see a large infrastructure package advance before the elections. Where I am optimistic, however, is, after the election, I think there's growing consensus among both parties of a need to invest in infrastructure and do it better. We saw last summer, in a bipartisan fashion, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee passed a highway reauthorization bill that had a large climate chapter, including several really great ideas on climate resilience. So that, again, gives me hope that regardless of how the elections play out, we might be able to get something done. So with that, and in the interest of the 5 minutes left that we have for this webinar, I will conclude and open up for questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Natalie. And I think we'll be brief in our federal level summary, as you did cover a lot of this already, but I want to turn it over to my colleague, Andy, who will just give us a quick snapshot of where things stand in terms of the opportunities to, as Natalie very eloquently put it, build back better, and some of the infrastructure proposals that are out there. And then we're going to turn to some great questions that we received in the audience chat.
Great, Lynn. Thank you for that intro. Really quickly, some high-level updates on federal policy. Obviously, as Natalie mentioned, Congress is very much in the thick of dealing directly with the COVID-19 situation, and we're still very much in relief mode. So Senate Republicans have unveiled their $1 trillion relief package this week and are currently negotiating with Democrats and the White House on a compromise. The Democrats have passed their $3 trillion package in the House. Again, this is very much an aid package and shouldn't be seen as a stimulus. It largely focuses on continued unemployment assistance, direct checks to families, state and local government aid, healthcare, those sorts of things. There has been discussion of a potential stimulus package, but again, as Natalie mentioned, it's unclear if this will get passed before the election. It's probably not likely. Although it is worth noting that last week, 7 Senate Republicans, including Lisa Murkowski, who chairs the Energy and Water Committee, sent a letter to Majority Leader McConnell expressing support for policies that support clean energy as Congress considers COVID relief and recovery. And then moving on to transportation and infrastructure. So in late June, House Democrats advanced their $1.5 trillion infrastructure package. This included a number of clean energy measures, such as an extension of clean energy tax incentives through 2025. The bill would open up the ITC to storage and offshore wind. It would also raise the EV manufacturer cap from 200,000 to 600,000. And focus on other investments in EV charging infrastructure. The Senate has its own infrastructure package as well as an energy package, but it is unclear if these will come to the floor before the election. And then moving on to bullet point 3, there has been a cluster of climate plans that have been introduced. So in February, we had Representative McCarthy and House Republicans unveiling their climate plan, which focused largely on carbon capture measures, such as planting 1 trillion trees, expanding and making permanent the 45Q CCS tax credit, as well as boosting R&D of carbon capture technology for natural gas plants. And then we had Democrats on the House Select Committee on Climate Change unveiled their Climate Crisis Action Plan, which is a blueprint for congressional action to deal with the climate crisis. That was on June 30th. This targeted net zero economy-wide emissions by 2050 with several interim targets along the way. And then we had the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force on July 8th roll out its recommendations to the Biden campaign and DNC. These included eliminating carbon pollution from power plants entirely by 2035 through technology-neutral standards. It also included targeting net zero greenhouse gas emissions for all new buildings by 2030 and installing 500,000 public charging stations for EVs. Shortly after the Biden campaign released its $2 trillion infrastructure plan, which many see as his vision for an economic recovery package. It reflected many of the recommendations of the Unity Task Force, including a zero carbon power sector by 2035. It had lots of other specific plans, such as energy efficiency upgrades to 4 million commercial buildings, cash rebates, and incentives for home energy efficiency improvements. Moving on to appropriations. FY 2021 appropriations bills are advancing, including energy and water, which passed the House Appropriations Committee on July 6th. This bill includes $49.6 billion in energy and water development programs, a 3% increase from last year. It also includes a side supplemental title, which isn't going anywhere, but it serves as a vision for a stimulus package, and that provides an additional $23.5 billion in emergency funding for DOE to modernize energy infrastructure and grow the clean energy economy. The energy water bill includes massive COVID-19 emergency spending provisions across several departments, including $8 billion in supplemental funding for the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And then on Friday, we saw the House passed a $260 billion four-bill minibus. So this is rolling up several different titles into one. That includes the Interior Environment spending bill covering the EPA with a 10% increase for Energy Star. So that was positive. The House is expected to approve its $1.3 trillion six-bill package this week. So that includes the energy water bill. On the Senate side, Senate committee action on appropriations is expected in September. It's also worth noting the House and Senate have both passed their own versions of national defense spending bills. So that's the NDAA. And these include some energy measures designed to promote resilience and encourage the deployment of energy savings performance contracts. So they will have to work that out in negotiation, but that is a positive sign as well. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Lynn.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that summary, Andy, and thank you all to all of our panelists. And I know that we are at time here. We're going to be circulating some links by email. We encourage you to participate in our efforts to gather information about impacts of COVID-19 on the clean energy industry, as well as advocate for support in economic recovery. I put both Lisa's and my email addresses here if you have follow-up questions or ideas you wanted to share. And for those who are able to stay on the line and wish to stay on the line a couple minutes longer, I'll just pick two of the questions we got in our chat box to go over with our panelists. And one, I think there was a lot of conversation about how the COVID-19 pandemic is creating extreme, constraints on state budgets. Clearly, it's creating constraints at the federal level as well. So what are some of the policy mechanisms? We talked about these briefly, but just are there any additional thoughts regarding public-private partnerships, performance contracting, and ways that we can really unlock private investment in building and modernizing our infrastructure?
Do you want to jump in first, Julian, or would you like me to? Oh, sounds like it looks like he might be muted, but if you can hear me, no, I understand and recognize, that the state and local funding issue is a huge concern. Out in California, a lot of our clean energy programs are funded by revenues from the cap and trade auctions. And for those who didn't see, the second quarter auction netted, I think, 5% of what the first quarter auction did. So that's going to have an impact to a lot of the programs and that we need to get to our decarbonization goals. I think we, as a private sector, can play a role in helping partly to fill that gap through public-private partnerships. I think one of the opportunities that we've been talking about with our communities and as part of our kind of, resilience planning is the BRIC program that I think a lot of folks have mentioned on this call. Are there ways that we can leverage some of that federal funding to, do a down payment, but then are there opportunities that we as the private sector can come in and offer resources, offer expertise, et cetera, because we know a lot of these projects are going to take public-private partnerships to get accomplished.
Yeah, I would agree with all of the above, and I would just say from a transactional standpoint, it leads to one of the points I said earlier that providing access to capital, be it direct loans or even loan guarantees, but really ensuring that they can be allowed for public-private partnerships, third-party finance and loan systems. We've been very successful at doing that, say for solar projects, right? Third-party owned and being able to finance those, but how can we we don't have the same kind of revenue model that we do for some of the building improvements and the efficiency improvements that we're going to make, as well as in transportation. This came up a lot in our school board conversations that, they really need to increase their fleet, right? School departments typically don't own their fleets. They enter into a contract with a third party who's a private provider. If they want them to expand, they're going to need access to capital. So any federal funding that could be made, again, either direct or through loan guarantees, if it can be extrapolated out to the private sector that are doing third-party finance owned and operated deal structures with public agencies, that would be huge in allowing capital to flow so that these improvements can be made.
Excellent, thank you. And a final question to end on for maybe this would be good to pose to our state panelists. So over to Rebecca and Mike and Laura. All of you spoke a bit about the intersection of many different types of resilience and definitions of resilience. And some of the themes that you covered included climate resilience and preparation, environmental justice concerns or resilience. And then also we talked a little bit about public health and how COVID-19 has raised the awareness about needs to be prepared for pandemics such as this. I'm curious, in the work that you've been doing so far, where do you see the interests of these three kinds of resilience, so climate, environmental justice, and public health align? And where do you see potential conflicts in preparing for these different kinds of threats?
So this is Mike. I'll go first. The conflict could be the industries and the different critical infrastructures fighting over limited dollars for mitigation or state revenue or state bonding. That could be tough. And so we've created a group to bring together both public and private sectors to talk about that. But it was in the early stages. And I think the one thing that we can agree upon in our state is, we see sea level rising. We need energy storage. We're vulnerable for petroleum. We do not have any refineries, so our stuff is sitting in a fuel hub that we call the critical energy hub. That's our Achilles heel. So they all come together around justice because they impact the right by low income communities. So there's a lot of focus on those type of things that everybody's in agreement. It's just about how to pay for it and how to actually mitigate it. So I'll stop right there.
Yeah, I think as we look at budgets, it's really important that we keep funding that we've already identified, particularly funding that's geared towards communities, again, who we've seen disproportionately impacted by climate impacts, by the pandemic. Considering like our energy efficiency programs, have it passed, in the past sometimes been swept of funds because of other budget constraints, but that just hinders our ability to help the communities who when they're in the pandemic and and can't go to work, and so that is not the time to you want to be able to help those communities who are still have to keep the lights on and the water running, and we don't want to attack programs that are focused on those communities who are impacted by the pandemic as well as climate. But also, again, where we see sort of the alignment is looking at how there's underlying conditions that are exacerbated by shocks and stresses like hurricanes, like climate change, and pandemics. And so when we try to address some of those underlying issues, we can address multiple challenges. There's been quite a bit of talk about sort of transit-oriented development in Connecticut and alignment of that with affordable housing. And that's been talked about from an equity and environmental justice perspective, but it is also a strategy that we proposed in Connecticut back in 2018 to lower our vehicle miles traveled and lower our carbon emissions as one example. So the way, the positive on this is, we have a lot of challenges, but climate is so vast that it overlaps with many other issues. So you can find solutions that address multiple challenges at the same time.
Yeah, and Lynn, I would just add that thinking about it through the lens of, securing funding, working with policy, trying to gain policy maker support, whether it's Congress or state legislatures or city councils, being able to provide that multiple benefits, multiple value, cross-sector collaboration and benefit always wins, particularly when you're talking about the environment. So if you're able to, bringing in these other co-benefits, a great example of a transit project that also addresses housing, repeatedly flooding issues, ecosystem benefits, like that always wins and helps you really make a compelling case from a budget perspective and a program perspective.
Excellent. Well, really appreciate your insights and I guess, I don't know if optimism is exactly the right word, but everyone sort of at the state level thinking proactively about how to address these multiple challenges in a cohesive and compatible way. So I wanted to thank again our partners at Pew and National Governors Association for partnering with us, and thank all of our terrific panelists for your expertise and sharing your insights with us today. We really appreciate your leadership at the state level and at the corporate level to address the challenges posed by this pandemic, as well as some of the ongoing challenges we have been facing in the climate change space. So appreciate everyone's participation today, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one.